Okay, that's my cue. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for that incredible introduction. And Carol, thank you. I feel like I'm putting Carol on the spot here with that recommendation. My name is Scott. I'm an alcoholic, and I have a great joy and honor and privilege to be asked to share with you tonight my experience, strength, and hope. And let's get a few things out of the way right out of the gate. I have a sober date, and that is June 2nd, 1989. I consider my continuous sobriety to be my greatest accomplishment in life. And for somebody with an ego like mine, I take no credit for that. And it's something I'd love to take credit for, but I take no credit for it. All the credit goes to a God of my understanding today, to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and to the people of Alcoholics Anonymous. So thank you all for helping me first get sober and now remain sober, and invite me here tonight to share my experience, strength, and hope. The reading that was given at the beginning from the forward there about the technology advances, I want to talk about that just for a quick second, because what happened to me today, because of the technological advances that we have experienced, at midday today, I received a text with a flyer, your flyer, which came from a friend whom I only know via Zoom. I've since have met in person, asking me if this is me. And it is, and I don't know if they're here tonight. And I'm from the Virgin Islands. I live in the Virgin Islands. I got sober in the Virgin Islands, but I'm currently in Vermont and able to log on to this meeting. And I see my sponsor is here, which, I don't travel with a tribe. I don't let everyone know in my group and my circle and my tribe, oh, hey, I'm speaking here tonight. Come hear my wonderful message. But somehow my sponsor was told by someone else, and I see him here, and I see other people that I know here as well. And isn't Zoom great? I mean, really, this is just something incredibly wonderful that has come from our pandemic, and will be with us forever, I believe. And those that are serving the group, and Stephen tonight in the readers, and the people that are hosting the meeting, and the people that may be working to keep bombers out and everything. You guys are the modern day ashtray cleaners and coffee cup washers and chair folders, and make sure the room is clean. Let's be good tenants. And if none of that makes any sense to you, that means you got sober during the pandemic. But I want to just tell you that there was a time where we all met in person, and we all are meeting in person again. And we filled many rooms that were painted white, but over the years turned yellow from cigarette smoke. And they were built out of asbestos and all these other scary things that we have. And now I see my friend Laura has signed on as well. So, oh my God, everybody's showing up here little by little. But anyway, let me get right down to the story here. So I live in the Virgin Islands. I got sober June 2nd, 1989. I have a home group. It's a happy hour group. We meet Monday and Friday in person. We meet on Wednesday on Zoom. All of our virtual meetings can be found at aavirginislands.org. Please visit us either online virtually, or when you're there, come visit us at any one of a number of our groups on St. Thomas. I got sober in the Virgin Islands, but I'm not from the Virgin Islands. My accent may be coming through. I'm from New York. I'm from Long Island. And that was where I began my drinking. And I was raised by a couple of city kids who moved out to the country, it was called at that time, and they loved alcohol, and alcohol was celebrated in the home that I grew up in. It wasn't something that I had any bad memories or experiences. I just remember my house was somewhat of a party house. There were always people gathering in my house, coming through at all hours of the day. My parents built a bar in the basement. I found out later in life that I was a bit of a beer baby, bounced from lap to lap and always sipping everyone's beer. I had a little taste for the teething medication that allows me to attend another fellowship. but I have those issues as well. Tonight I'm here to talk about my love affair with alcohol, what it did to me, how it impacted me, how I used it, how I drank it. I'm not one of those people who comes before you and says, "Oh, I hated alcohol. I hated the taste, hated the smell, hated everything that I loved everything. None of it was offensive to me. I found out over the years that it was very offensive. My drinking was very offensive to everyone else. Wasn't offensive to me. Wasn't even offensive to me right up until the time I came in Alcoholics Anonymous. Wasn't even offensive to me until I got down to the causes and conditions, until I got down into the doctor's opinion and learned about the body and into more about alcoholism, learned about the mind. And really, when I started making amends, then I saw how offensive it was to everyone else, and I had to pay back that money. But, there I was. It was the summer of 6th grade. I sat down with a couple of friends of mine and we sat down to drink. And I learned early on in Alcoholics Anonymous, not because I learned it on my own, but because it was pointed out to me by my friend Martha S., who's still sober today, that not everyone's my story is not going to resonate with everyone. So for that reason, I'm just going to read a quick paragraph from our big book so that you heard something from me from our approved AA literature. And it's a paragraph on page 52, and it's kind of where my drinking began. It says most people know it as the bedevilments. We were having trouble with personal relationships. We couldn't control our emotional natures. We were a prey to misery and depression. We couldn't make a living. We had a feeling of uselessness. We were full of fear. We were unhappy. We couldn't seem to be of real help to other people. Was not a basic solution to these bedevilments more important than whether we could see newsreels of lunar flight? Now, I was already experiencing all of those things right there in that summer of 6th grade. I already felt useless. I already couldn't understand life. I didn't feel like I was dropped here without a roadmap. I felt like I was here, and what were you doing here? That's what I felt like. And, life didn't seem right. And I truly sat down with a couple of quarts of Ballantine Ale with one sole purpose: to get drunk. That was it. And we got drunk the very first time. And I always tell this story because it's how my drinking began. And when you begin here, I can assure you it doesn't get much better. We sat down with these quarts of beer and we heard these urban legends about how to get drunk faster. If you do a shot every 60 seconds, and then you jump up and spin around. If you do a shot every 60 seconds, jump up, spin around, have your friend grab your chest until you hyperventilate, this is not normal drinking for an 11-year-old, right? So it doesn't really, the only thing social about it was that other people were there. That was the only thing social about my drinking at that time of my life. And from there to the day that I got into Alcoholics Anonymous at the age of 25, the things I did, the places I went, and the people I hurt were all so that I could drink. When you start at that early age, you don't really have a visible means of getting the alcohol unless you're going to steal it from your house or your friend's parents, wherever. You're going to get booze from wherever you can. But then sooner or later, you have to stop buying it. And I started getting in that kind of trouble where you start acquiring money that isn't yours, and you do that via breaking into homes or getting arrested or selling other people's things. There's a joke in Alcoholics Anonymous that an alcoholic will steal your stuff and lie about it. A drug addict will steal your stuff. An alcoholic will, I always get this wrong. An alcoholic will steal your stuff and lie about it. A drug addict will steal your stuff, lie about it, maybe help you look for it. My sponsor told me, he said, "Yeah, Scott, you're one of those people who steal your stuff, lie about it, help you look for it. And then if there's a reward involved, help you get it back." That was what my sponsor told me. And that was basically what I did. So, by the age of 14, 15 years old, I'm in and out of the court system on Long Island. They were not prosecuting minors as adults at that time. But what they were doing was shipping kids off to a pilot program now known as Scared Straight, where you would get locked up with a bunch of other juvenile delinquents for the day. And the idea would be that you'd get scared straight when locked up in a state penitentiary in New Jersey. And then you would never do any more crime or anything. Well, that didn't work for me because while I was sitting there with my ego and my arrogance, I couldn't even connect the dots that, I was thinking to myself, yes, you're here because you got caught. And I couldn't even connect the dots that the reason I was there was because I got caught. I was thinking to myself, couple hours, I'm going to be back out in the suburbs. All is going to be fine. And I'm just going to get on with my life, right? Because I love to be disconnected. I did not know I was full of fear, but I knew that I didn't like the way I felt. And I knew that when I drank, it took that away. There were other things that were going on in my house around this time. My parents were now divorced. My mother was raising three of us in a single family household. And believe me, none of if it comes across in any way that I blame my upbringing, blame my parents, blame the teachers, blame my girlfriends, blame my employers. Statute of limitations is up on everyone. Alcoholics Anonymous and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous takes that away. It helps me become responsible, helps me become accountable. And more importantly, I can be counted on. That's what sobriety gives me the ability to stand up and say, this is who I am, this is what I've done, and this is what I'm prepared to do. And this is the person I want to become. Alcoholics Anonymous gives me those tools. So there I was, 15, getting into all that trouble, and it didn't get much better, And then finally, at the age of 2021, the other guy who's here tonight, who actually is with me this week, is the guy that 12-stepped me, a guy named Eddie is in this meeting as well. So it's great that the guy who 12-stepped me in 1986, 85 is here. My sponsor's here. Laura is here, one of the biggest mentors in my sobriety. And I don't know who else, but I'm sure there are others. But so Eddie 12-stepped me, and I sat down with Eddie in his basement. He had gotten sober, and we did basic old-fashioned 12-step work. He just took me through what brought him to his bottom and what he's done since, and the decision he made to go to Alcoholics Anonymous. And I said, yes, I am. Yes, I am one of you. I must have this thing, right? Where have we heard that before? And I said, I'm going to go to Alcoholics Anonymous. But the problem was, it was the fall. I was in trouble again in New York. Cops were basically knocking at the front door. I went out the back door. I didn't join Eddie in AA in 1986. I took off for the Caribbean. And I'd already been down in the Caribbean a couple of times. So I knew some of the islands. I knew some of what was going on down there. And that's where I ended up. I ended up in St. Thomas, which is my home from that day to this. And St. Thomas is a great place. If you've never been, it's a great place to go for alcoholics. And it's a great place to go for sober alcoholics. We have great AA. But it's the kind of place where, if you've never been, the very first thing they hand you when you get off the plane is a free rum punch. And we drive on the left there. Don't ask me why. We bought the islands were purchased from the Danes in 1912. I'm sorry, from Denmark in 1912. And we've just kept that tradition. So you get off the plane, you get a free rum punch. A couple of minutes later, you get the keys to your rental car, and we tell you, oh yeah, drive on the left. Good luck. Have a nice week. But booze is very prominent. It's a very forgiving community. And in the 80s, it was all that was going on in the 80s, and all of the other extracurricular dry goods that were happening everywhere else were happening there as well, with abundance. And I indulged, and my life actually got a little bit better for a little bit of time, because there was nobody there that knew my story, and as invested as I was in my story and everything, and why I had to drink the way I drank, and, if you had my problems, that whole thing, none of that mattered down there, because everybody was kind of, I gravitated, as we often do, right to the types of people that we actually are before we come into Alcoholics Anonymous. So drinking at 8 a.m. or drinking at 8 p.m., coming to, and it's that time of day where you don't know, is it morning or is it dusk? Is it dusk? Is it dawn? You don't know, because it's a 24-hour cycle of drinking. And you can get employed, and you get employed as, if you're me, you get employed as a bartender or in the restaurant field. And that's what I did. And I just became that drunk bartender. And I actually did that a couple of years into my sobriety, which I don't recommend, but nobody else was offering me any work. I wasn't really qualified for any other work. And I had bills and commitments to pay at that point. So that's what I ended up doing for the first 2 years of my sobriety. But but eventually the problems would fall, it just catches up with us, right? I mean, you can only outrun so long. And for me, the bottom came fast and furious. A lot of alcoholics come into AA and we've let ourselves go, and usually our teeth are falling out or something. And the first thing we do is we go see a dentist for the first time in a couple of years. For me, it was like, I must have known I was coming to AA because I started going to the dentist about 2 months before I came into AA. I don't know why, but what happened is I couldn't get the kind of dental work I needed in St. Thomas. So I had to go over to San Juan, which introduced me to a whole bunch of different dry goods and really pressed the issue of my bottom. So I make my way back to St. Thomas with, stitches in my mouth and everything else. The last couple of weeks of my drinking is more of a matter of public record than it is my memory. But these are the facts that I do know, is that on the Wednesday before I came to my first meeting, I got into a fight with my house. Now, I don't know if anyone's ever done that before, but it's where you wake up and your furniture's all flipped over and maybe some windows are broken, the phone's ripped off the wall, you've got, roommates that are mad at you, you've got a black eye. This is what happened. And with no memory, no recollection of it all. And pulled myself together, went to work, had probably a drink or two that day, maybe the next day, don't remember. But on Friday, much like the story of the guy with the whiskey in his milk when he shows up for work on Tuesday. So on Friday, I'm trying to find out why my girlfriend's not talking to me. And I track her down at work and I walk into her place of employment just about the time where she was getting dropped off by a friend. And that was his only crime that day. But I thought the punishment should be to try and drown him in the restaurant fountain. I thought that was a pretty good idea. Now back to the bedevilments, right? Remember what it says here? It says, we were having trouble with personal relationships. We couldn't control our emotional natures. We were afraid of misery and depression. We couldn't make a living. We had a feeling of uselessness. We were full of fear. We were unhappy. We couldn't seem to be of real help to other people. It's amazing that I drank for the amount of time that I did, which was only 14 and a half years. And I had those bedevilments with me the entire time in one form or another. And I used all of those things. I blamed God. My relationship with God was one of great dependence, even before I got in AA, because I needed someone to blame for everything that was crappy in my life. And God served that role. God was the perfect patsy in my life. And I just blamed him for everything. Now, today, that's not the case. I turn to God for everything to save me. God has given me a life well beyond what I deserve and well beyond my expectations of what I thought I would have when I arrived here in Alcoholics Anonymous. So there I was, and trying to drown this guy. And the guy who owned the restaurant is in AA. So by the time I got back to my house, he had already called and left a message on the machine. And his 12-step advice was, no matter what problems you have or are having, keep them out of my restaurant. Now, ironically, when I showed up in AA, the first meeting where I bumped into him, he was one of the first people to extend a hand to me. And as did many other people in the community of St. Thomas that I harassed just horrendously. I was a Zoom bomber before Zoom even existed. I was that drunk that when I found out you were in AA, I would just be like, hey, how's that not drinking working? And everything else. I basically helped a lot of people keep it green by being the type of person that I was, obnoxious punk kid at 22, 23, 24 years old. See, because I had AA back still in my head from when Eddie 12-stepped me. And once that seed is planted, and I was in alcohol court-ordered counseling at 14, 15, and all those seeds were finally blooming on that day, June 2nd, 1989. So I went to my first meeting, and I'd love to sit here and tell you that I went to my first meeting, got a sponsor right at that meeting, did everything he said, and my life's been great ever since. And that would just be a lie. That's some other speaker. They're going to speak later in the week. My experience is that I came into Alcoholics Anonymous. I am a member of the Sometimes Slowly class. I didn't really like what was being offered. I thought 25 was a little young, perhaps, and everybody in the program at that time where I lived, it was the closest person in age was probably 40, and that was just old. There's a disconnect between 25 and 40 that doesn't really exist between like 40 and 50 or 40 and 60. 25 and 40, or those that get sober even younger. There's just, I just don't think you understand my problems. And I would come to find out that you understood my problems just perfectly. There was no problem at all with anybody understanding my problems. My problems were more obvious to everyone else than they were to me. I needed to quit drinking, and I needed to stop defining and stop worrying about what the definition of an alcoholic was. I needed to no longer think of alcoholism as something to be proud of. I actually aspired to be an alcoholic. When I knew growing up, there were people that could drink a case of beer. I wanted to be like them. So the real question for me wasn't about redefining what an alcoholic was. It was about finding out what the definition of alcoholism was. And I would find that out through the teachers and the mentors that have been with me in Alcoholics Anonymous. I had to find out and learn that I was drinking because I was bodily and mentally different than my fellows. That once I ingested alcohol of any kind into my system, the ability to decide when or where or how much or when to stop, that was taken away from me. And I don't worry about why. I don't, the why is kind of the booby prize of life. What am I going to do about it? And that it's not so important to find out why I'm going down the toilet, but how I'm going to get out of the toilet. And, at that point in my life, it wasn't the worst day in my life, far from it, but it was enough for me to, for the first time, consider that alcohol was the problem. So there I was in that first meeting, and I met a guy named Doug, and Doug was one of the first people that reached out to me. I don't remember much of what happened at that first meeting, second meeting, third meeting, first dozen meetings. Somewhere around 2 or 3 years, I was telling my story one time. My sponsor came up to me after I got done, and he said, that's not how that happened. And I was like, what do you mean? He goes, well, that's not how your early recovery went. So I stopped telling the story of my early recovery. There's actually people on this screen tonight that can tell you the story of my early recovery. I was a disruptive young man, a young child, I should say, at Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. If you laughed when I was sharing, I would stop the meeting and yell across the room, "This is funny to you? This is my life. I'm in AA now." And they said, "You're laughing?" I didn't know people were laughing because they're identifying. I wasn't very bright. Okay. I had my way of thinking, and your way of thinking just didn't seem attractive to me. So I was holding on to my way of thinking. I was holding on to my stories, all my lies and everything that I told myself. I had literally, as the saying goes, I gave up one thing. I gave up everything for one thing. And in Alcoholics Anonymous, I give up one thing and I get everything back, and so much more. But there I was, disrupting the meetings and everything else. And finally, in around 6 months, I knew what was wrong with AA. So I had to fix it. So I tried joining a group, and that group had I was at 3 months. I'm sorry. And that group had a group conscience. At 3 months, you could start chairing meetings. And I said, all right, I'm going to fix this AA thing. I know what's wrong. And at that business meeting, they voted to change the group conscience to 6 months. You had to have 6 months to chair a meeting, while I was there with my hand up saying, but wait, I have 3 months. I'll take Monday night. And they're like, hold on, we'll get back to you. So they changed it to 6 months. So I said, I'll show them. Okay. So I quit that group and I joined another group. And we only have a couple of groups on St. Thomas in 1989. So I joined the Happy Hour group, which is my home group to this day. But what an interesting thing happened at that business meeting. They gave me the commitment, all right. But they also gave me this format. And they told me I had to follow this format of how the meeting should be chaired. But what they also gave me was the pamphlet rack. And this was a very tricky thing they did to me, because this book I couldn't read. This book I was reading like a novel. This book I was taking to the volleyball court at the beach and reading like a book of how to pick up girls or something. I wasn't reading it like the textbook that it is. I wouldn't even know it was a textbook until later on, with a sponsor, right? Which I would not be here tonight if I did not get a sponsor right out of the gate. Now, I haven't done everything my sponsor always said. I still don't do everything my sponsor always says, but when I do, my life goes much better. But I would not be here. I would not have stayed sober. Were it not for the grace, the compassion, the love, the patience, the tolerance, the generosity of a sponsor. So I just want to say one thing on that subject of sponsors. Don't ever fire your sponsor. If it's not working out, say thank you. I need to get another sponsor, because basically firing them is telling them, you volunteered for a job. I don't like the way you're doing it, and you're fired. It's just not a good thing. It's not a good look, as somebody told me once. So I got this pamphlet rack, and I got the time, and I also got the book Living Sober. Someone gave me the book Living Sober. So the pamphlets are, average read of about 5 to 7 minutes. And that was which was perfect, because that was about the attention span of what I had. I get through the pamphlets, and I can get through Living Sober, which has a bunch of topics that I'm far too hip, slick, and cool to be bringing up in an AA meeting. But I need that information nonetheless. And again, in quick snippets. 8 paragraphs, 5 paragraphs, right about my attention span at that time. So I kind of stayed sober on the pamphlets and Living Sober. But then it became necessary to work the steps. And my sponsor at that time and how I worked the steps the first time was as my sponsor had done them, which was a combination of the big book, the 12 and 12, a bunch of Hazelton literature workbooks that were around that people were using in the fellowship at that time. And the way his sponsor brought him through the steps. And guess what? It was sufficient to keep me sober. It was sufficient to help me deal with the wreckage of my present. It was sufficient to keep me with forward momentum in the program, keep me sober, and to start knocking on the doors and dealing with the people, like I say, the wreckage of my present. I wasn't quite ready to do the deep dive into the whole life, nor did I even know that existed in this literature. I didn't know that you turn the pages and you find out exactly how to take a step, when to take a step, what'll happen when you take the step, what'll happen if you don't take the step. I didn't know any of that yet. But what I did know was that I had motion. I had forward motion, and I was knocking on doors. I finally got myself to the point where I was knocking on doors and paying back some money. And you see, that was where the real recovery for me began, in the restitution and getting right with the world. Up until that point, I began to get right with myself in step 1. In steps 2 and 3, I reintroduced myself to God, a God that I resented, a God that I blamed for everything, but I reintroduced it and kept an open mind that perhaps this God was the God that I had hoped for and looked for my whole life, but didn't believe existed. And then I began to get right with the sponsor by reading him all of that stuff that I'd written down, looked at step 6 and 7, and as my friend Martha says, living them every day from that day to this. Because the character defects, shortcomings that I had when I was new are not the same that I have today, but new ones still pop up every day. So I'm living in 6 and 7. I'm trying to stay current with that. But until I knocked on the doors and got right with the world, I was really just hiding out in AA. And it became it became time to do that. And that first go around through the amends was, it was a tight group. It was a lot of people on St. Thomas. It was my immediate family, and it was some people on Long Island. And for me, it wasn't the experience that's written about in the book to the extent that, where it says quite often the man we're approaching will admit some of his own wrongdoings. I never had that experience. I never had the experience that I hear so many people share about when we approach people with the money that we owe them. They're like, oh my God, I'm so happy for you. You're sober now. Keep the money, donate it to charity. We don't need it. We're just so happy you're alive. No, I've had the opposite. I've had people that I've approached with a number in mind, and they're like, Scott, how'd you come up with this number? And their number is never lower than mine. So there was a lot of back and forth with some people with the amends. I had a lot of doors slammed in my face. So I wasn't experiencing the promises that are promised, that are offered to us in the big book, right? I was mad at my sponsor. It was his idea that I do this, that I go knocking on these doors. I was mad at the people in the program that were sharing great experiences of what was happening. But I just wasn't feeling that. So I wasn't feeling the freedom. So, even at that time of my sobriety, I was still full of fear. I hadn't done this fear inventory that I would learn about in very soon here. But now I'm like 2 years sober, and I'm threatening somebody with physical violence, and I end up in the back of a police car. Again, back to the sometimes slowly class, because I was doing just enough. I was treating AA like that saying, take what the buffet is saying, take what you need and leave the rest. For me, that saying kills more alcoholics than it helps them, because I thought I knew what I needed when I was new. I thought I knew, oh, you have a sponsor? Maybe I don't need a sponsor. You have a 7-day meeting schedule? Maybe I don't need it. I can take what I need and leave the rest, to the point where I'm not in Alcoholics Anonymous. I could be such an anonymous member of Alcoholics Anonymous that you don't even know I'm a member. Right. And I don't want that. So for, a brief time in my recovery, I got away from AA because of the resentments and because I wasn't doing the work. But more importantly, because people had shown up in St. Thomas at that time, and they were talking about the program of recovery as outlined in our book. They were talking about the problem, the solution, and the planned program of recovery in a way which was completely foreign to me. And two of them are here tonight. And they were talking about the steps, turning the pages. And they were talking about it in such a way that made me feel, as I've heard one of them say, that I was doing it wrong. I didn't hear what they were talking about, the promises and all the good things that happen when you do it this way. What I heard was, you're doing it wrong. That's what I heard. So I had to resent these people. I had to make fun of them, and I did, and I've since made amends for that. But I made fun of Laura Kay at our home group. I'm like, really? We don't care how you do it on the Cape. She had relocated from the Cape down to St. Thomas, and Pat relocated from Boston. I'm like, we don't care how you do it in Boston. This is the Virgin Islands. We're doing just fine. We don't need all this big book stuff that you're talking about. Well, I finally got up the courage to ask one of them to take me through the steps as they're outlined in the big book. Now, that's not the only way I've done the steps. I've done the Wally version, the back to basics. There's no hard, fast rule. One of the most rewarding ways for me, one of the most fulfilling ways for me, has been working the steps out of the big. That has answered many of the questions that I've had as it relates to my insanity, as it relates to my insecurity, as it relates to my fears. Because you see, in that other time that I did those inventories, I never really got down to true causes and conditions. I had no idea how much fear was running my life. I had no idea how it was impacting and showing up and repeating in other emotions, until I actually got to look at it on paper. Ask ourselves where these fears had come from. Where had self-reliance fell? A couple of the easiest low-hanging fruit, fear of financial insecurity. I can't imagine why I was financially insecure. I was barely employable. I didn't know how to save money. I didn't know how to not take money that didn't belong to me. I mean, I just assumed when it was left on the counter, it was left there for me, even in sobriety. I mean, I'm that guy. I created a profit sharing program without the owner's knowledge in early recovery. That is not what we do here in Alcoholics Anonymous. Eventually, we get to the steps that address that, and I have, happily. But that is not what we promise people here. So don't take that early recovery path. Take the path when I was finally uncomfortable enough, still full of fear, still sober, but just not feeling the love that we feel here in Alcoholics Anonymous. So when I went through the steps that time and subsequent times since, I am able to look at myself from a different perspective. I'm able to look at my part in things. I talked about that accountability. I talk about how I can be counted on today. I had no accountability. Honesty and commitment, two words that were rarely used in my life. They were two words that I needed to not only define, but live. And I define and live them every day today. And I do them because of this program, not because it's an original idea. You know, as I've worked through those steps and I got back into 8 and 9 on a deeper dive and started knocking on some of the doors which had emotional price tags, I found out those were even harder than paying back the money. You know, it took me a number of years to honor the amends that I was making. A lot of times in Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, we focus only on the front end of that amend. We don't focus on the back end of the amend, how I'm going to show up in these people's lives now that I've promised to show up as someone different, not as the person that harmed them the first time. You know, for example, I wanted to be a son to my mother, so I needed to show up in that capacity. You know, and I had the privilege and honor of being with my mother till she left this earth as somebody other than that pain that I described to you. I mean, believe me, my mother did not deserve to have the son that she had in me, but AA and sobriety allowed me to show up in her life and to be there. And at the end of her life, have my sponsor tell me, you know, the greatest gift you gave her at the end was that she no longer had to worry about you. You know, and I stopped playing God. And when I was 17, my brother got into a diving accident that left him as a quadriplegic. Now, I blamed God for that. When I'd go through the steps, I'd find out that the reason my brother became a quadriplegic was because he was high on drugs and booze and dove off a roof into a pool, not something a sound, sane mind person would generally do. You know, it wasn't God's fault. It was my brother's fault. My brother's still with us, and I get to show up in his life today. And that's been a very difficult relationship because of my inability to honor the amend. I would make the amend to my brother, and then sometimes right in the middle of the amend, we would have a blow up right in the middle of the amend, and I'd completely undo it. Eventually, I got to the point where it's like, oh, wait a minute. I have to honor what I'm saying. I have to honor the promise I'm making to him to be somebody else, to be the person that I want to be the person I aspire to be. You know, the longer I stay sober in Alcoholics Anonymous, the more I need to remember from which I came. And regular attendance at meetings helps me do that. So, you know, it's not always a matter of what works. I mean, my opinion of what works. It's not always a matter of my opinion of what works. It's just a matter of what does work. And what does work is trying to keep in mind from what I came to what I want to be. Because if I'm measuring myself about how well I'm doing today against who I'm not or who I was yesterday, then there's a chance I'm going to rest on my laurels. And I don't want to do that. You know, I have an idea in my head each and every day of how to become a better person. And hopefully I do the work that does that. Now I have a template that helps me do that. And it comes in 10, 11, and 12. And I'm not here to take you through the steps. I'm just here to talk about the steps and tell you my experience, strength, and hope with them. And, you know, it could be different next week and it maybe was different last week, but this is my experience today. And this is where I'm at right here, right now. You know, in the 10th step, there's that one tricky word, right? Promptly. And sometimes promptly means never for me. So stuff gets built up again. You know, when we're wrong, promptly admit it. I mean, the joke in my home group was the 10th step actually reads, continue to take your inventory, and when you were wrong, promptly told you. You know, but it's about taking my inventory on a regular basis, you know, throughout the day, at night, when we retire, you know, all of this, that gray area between 10 and 11, right? And if I'm not doing that on a regular basis, that red wagon of resentments is going to get built up. The amends are going to get built up. The fears are going to get built up again. And what's going to happen? Well, I know what's going to happen. I'm going to start making fun of everyone in Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm going to get a resentment towards Alcoholics Anonymous. And then I'm going to be looking for a new meeting or maybe no meeting at all. You know, it used to just be a coffee pot and a resentment. Now it's just an internet connection and a resentment, right? That's all we need to find a new group. But if I'm not current, how do I get current? Well, I get current and stay current in step 11. Sought through prayer and meditation. Now, how do I seek? You know, as my friend Chuck W. says, you should see me seek when I've lost my keys. But when I find them, I stop looking for them. See, I can't treat my sobriety like that. So how do I improve my conscious contact with God? By regular attendance at meetings, by making myself available to work with others, by trying to carry the message of Alcoholics Anonymous to the person who suffers, by being that person who's suffering and allowing somebody else to carry the message to me. See, because that's a privilege too, that there are people on this screen tonight that sometimes care more about me and my problems than even I care about me and my problems. And they want me to be a better person and to show up differently and better in this world. And step 11 gives me a perfect template for it. My entire day is laid out. And I was looking for that my whole life. And I didn't even know it until it was offered to me. And it was broken down to me on those pages that it was, that it's upon awakening, when it's retire at night, as we go throughout the day. It covers every aspect of who I am and how I show up in every moment of the day. And in step 12, if I am not carrying the message to the alcoholic who still suffers, the chances of me forgetting I'm powerless are extremely great. And the same methods that I just told you with how I sought through prayer and meditation to improve are the same ways I carry the message so that I don't forget that I'm powerless over alcohol. Regular attendance at meetings, a relationship with a sponsor, make myself available to be a sponsor, having a God of my understanding in my life, not trying to misunderstand God and blame God. And if I'm not practicing these principles in all my affairs, what happens? My life is going to become unmanageable. So it's just a short distance back to step 1 from step 12, and it's just not how I want to show up in life today. And I'm just out of time, I see. So I'm going to just read one more thing. I read to you from page 52, but another reading for me, which I really love, is on page 152. And it's the stupid, boring, and glum. We have shown how we have got out from under. You say, yes, I'm willing, but am I to be consigned to a life where I shall be stupid, boring, and glum like some righteous people I see? I know I must get along without liquor, but how can I? Have you a sufficient substitute? Yes, there is a substitute, and it is vastly more than that. It's a fellowship. It is a fellowship in Alcoholics Anonymous. There you will find release from care, boredom, and worry. Your imagination will be fired. Life will mean something at last. The most satisfactory years of your existence lie ahead. Thus we find the fellowship, and so will you. And I was offered 2 things when I showed up in Alcoholics Anonymous: stupid, boring, and glum, and happy, joyous, and free. Unfortunately, I made my early recovery very difficult by choosing stupid, boring, and glum. But I'm happy, joyous, and free today, and happy to be here with you tonight. And thank you very much.